Welcome. Tonight, the convent kitchen will open its doors for you. By day, it's plain and quiet. By night, it becomes a place of hidden flavors, whispered messages, and dishes meant for mouths that will never speak their names. Stay a while. The first scent of cinnamon is already in the air. The convent was always quiet at night, except for the kitchen. When the rest of the dormitories sank into the shallow breathing of early sleep, a thread of warm air would begin to slide under the heavy oak door, heavy with the scent of cinnamon. It was the kind of smell that seemed to speak, that made your skin prickle with curiosity before your mind could give it a name. Sister Ines, the youngest novice, learned to breathe it in slowly, as if afraid someone might hear her inhale too deeply. She had been told cinnamon was a luxury brought by ships from far away, a spice reserved for feast days and solemn vows. But here, it was whispering through the corridors on an ordinary Tuesday night. The kitchen in daylight was an austere place. Stone walls still damp from morning washing, iron pots lined up like soldiers, shelves of barley and beans stacked in neat order. But at night, it changed. The shadows became softer, alive with the red-gold flicker of the hearth, and the smell, oh, the smell was no longer humble. It carried sweetness like a promise, laced with something sharper, like the memory of a warm hand held too long. Sister Ines had not yet been invited inside after Compline prayers, but she had learned to pause in the cloister hallway, where the draught carried every note of the recipe being born. One night, she dared to step closer, her bare feet silent on the cold flagstones. Through the kitchen's cracked door, she glimpsed Sister Maria bent over a copper pot, stirring something thick and dark. The elder nun's face was half-lit, and her lips moved without sound, as if she were reciting a prayer only the food could hear. Behind her, jars lined the table, honey, figs, rosewater, and something else Ines couldn't name. She noticed a small earthen bowl of almonds, soaking in milk, their pale skins slipping off in the warm liquid. It struck her as beautiful, almost indecently so, as if almonds could be undressed. That night, Ines could not sleep. The sheets felt too coarse, her hands smelled faintly of stone dust from scrubbing the chapel floor, and in her mind, she kept seeing the way the spoon moved through the thick mixture, slow, deliberate, like a hand trailing through bathwater. The smell of cinnamon seemed to cling to her hair, and when she closed her eyes, she thought she could taste it, though she'd had nothing but bread and cabbage for supper. Something had begun. The first time Ines saw the bowl of honey, it was almost an accident. The moonlight fell across the convent courtyard, catching on something golden in the shadows of the kitchen door. She had been sent to fetch more firewood for the dormitory stove, her hands numb from the cold, her breath forming tiny clouds in the night air. When she passed by the kitchen, she saw the door ajar and the faintest thread of light spilling out, not candlelight but something warmer, the kind of glow that honey itself seems to give off, even in darkness. Inside, Sister Maria was not alone. Beside her stood Sister Beatrice, a tall woman with silver at her temples, her sleeves rolled up in a way that seemed almost unholy for a nun. They worked in silence, except for the soft clink of a spoon against ceramic. The honey was being poured into a shallow clay dish, its thick golden ribbon catching the firelight in slow folds. Ines could smell it even from the hallway, warm, almost floral, as if the bees had trapped a summer meadow in each drop. On the table beside the honey, there were figs sliced open, their ruby insides glistening like secrets revealed. A handful of cloves lay scattered near a small jar of crushed pepper, and there was a faint, teasing scent of wine, though no wine was kept openly in the convent. Beatrice took a brush made of bound reeds and began to coat the figs with honey, the motion so gentle it reminded Ines of the way her mother once braided her hair. Maria, meanwhile, was kneading a dough flecked with something green, perhaps crushed rosemary, perhaps something else entirely. Ines could feel the cold stone of the hallway floor biting at her feet, but she couldn't move. The air itself seemed to hum, as though the kitchen had become a chapel for a different kind of worship. She imagined the figs melting under the touch of fire, the honey thickening into a golden glaze, the scent filling not just the corridors but the skin, the breath, the thoughts. She didn't understand why it felt dangerous to watch, but she understood with a sudden and certain clarity that whatever was happening in that kitchen was not for the sisters' supper table. It happened on a night when the rain had been falling since Vespers, drumming against the cloister roof with the steadiness of a heartbeat. Ines was sweeping the hallway outside the kitchen, her head bowed, her robe damp at the hem. She thought she was alone until she heard the click of the kitchen latch and the slow creak of the door opening. Sister Maria appeared in the warm steam, her cheeks touched with a flush that had nothing to do with prayer. "Come in," Maria said, as though the words were not an invitation but an inevitability. Her voice was low, shaped for the night air, and Ines felt the syllables as much as she heard them. Inside, the air was thick with a sweetness that was almost intoxicating. Cinnamon again, but this time tangled with melted butter and the sharp, ghostly trace of citrus peel. The windows were fogged, and the fire in the hearth painted everything in tones of copper and gold. On the table, dough lay stretched and folded like fabric, its surface dimpled with sugar. A pot simmered in the corner, sending up curls of steam that clung to Ines's lashes. Maria handed her a small knife, its handle worn smooth. "Slice these," she said, pushing a bowl of peeled pears toward her. The fruit was warm from poaching, the flesh so tender that the knife slid through with barely a whisper. As she worked, Ines noticed her hands trembling, not from fear, but from the strange intimacy of being in this room, of touching something meant for pleasure in a place that claimed to live without it. The pears were placed in a dish already lined with something dark, a syrup perhaps, or the thick shadow of wine reduced to its essence. Maria moved quietly, measuring spices without scales, tasting with the tip of her finger, letting the taste linger before she nodded in satisfaction. At one point, she brushed past Ines to reach for a jar, and the touch of her sleeve left the scent of rosemary on Ines's skin. The sound of the rain outside seemed to fade, replaced by the slow, rhythmic folding of pastry, the gentle hiss of liquid hitting hot iron. When the pears were set into the pastry and brushed with egg yolk, Maria leaned close enough for Ines to see the tiny scars on her hands, the map of burns and cuts that marked a lifetime in kitchens. "You must never speak of this," she said, her eyes catching the firelight. "But you may taste." And that was the first night Ines learned that the mouth can remember as vividly as the heart. Not every dish in the kitchen of sins was meant for the sisters, and it didn't take Ines long to notice. That winter, While frost crusted the edges of the cloister garden, the kitchen doors would open at hours when the bell was silent. Men and women, cloaked and hooded, would slip inside without a word, leaving only the sound of wet boots on stone. They never knocked, and they never crossed themselves at the door. From her corner by the bread oven, Ines watched as Sister Beatrice greeted them with a nod, her hands still dusted in flour. No prayers were said. Instead, the visitors would remove small parcels from their satchels, pouches of saffron, wrapped lemons still green from the coast, small jars of something that caught the firelight like liquid amber. In return, Beatrice or Maria would pass them a covered dish, the cloth tied tightly with twine. Sometimes it was warm to the touch, as though it had only just left the oven. Once, Ines caught a glimpse of what was inside: roasted quail, its skin lacquered with honey, scattered with pomegranate seeds. The sight was almost shocking in the cold stone room, a burst of crimson and gold that felt indecent against the gray. Another time, she smelled a sauce so rich with garlic and wine that it seemed to cling to the walls long after the guests had gone. These were not meals for fasting or charity. These were indulgences, crafted in secrecy and exchanged like love letters. What unsettled Ines most was the quietness of it all. No one spoke above a murmur, and yet there was no shame in the air, only the kind of focus one might see in an artist painting in the early light. She began to suspect that these guests were not strangers to the sisters. Some touched Maria's hand in parting, their fingers lingering longer than polite. Others met Beatrice's eyes and held them for a breath too long. That night, lying awake in her cell, Ines thought about the quail, the honey, the pomegranate, the way the seeds had glistened like beads of blood on white linen. She wondered where those dishes were being eaten, and by whom. And for the first time, she wondered what it would be like to prepare something not for God, but for a single person waiting in the dark. It was Sister Beatrice who told her, though not in words. The lesson came one night when the fire was burning low and the air was thick with the scent of roasted almonds. Ines had been allowed to help grind them into paste, her hands sticky with honey, the pestle heavy in her grip. She was so focused on the rhythm, crush, turn, crush, that she didn't notice the man standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat. Beatrice didn't look at him. She simply reached over, took the pestle from Ines's hands, and set it aside. Then she pressed a single almond into Ines's palm and closed her fingers around it. "Go," she said softly, not unkindly. The man stepped into the room as Ines slipped out, the almond warm against her skin. She didn't understand why she had been sent away until she reached her cell and found herself holding the nut as though it were a coin, payment for her absence. The next morning, nothing was said. Beatrice didn't explain, and Ines didn't ask. But she understood enough to know that there were moments in that kitchen she was not yet meant to see. The dishes they made were not merely food. They were offerings, each plated with the precision of a gift meant to speak in place of words. Who they were for was never discussed, but the air around those moments had a different weight, one that pressed gently against the ribs. From then on, Ines began to notice the signs, the way the sugar was sifted more finely on certain nights, how Beatrice would choose the most perfect sprigs of thyme, or how Maria would polish the rim of a dish until it caught the light like gold. On those nights, Ines was always given some small, deliberate task in the farthest corner of the room. She learned, without anyone saying so, that the first rule of the kitchen of sins was not a matter of prayer or obedience. It was this: know when to look away. It was the first time she was allowed to stay until the end. The guest was a woman, tall, cloaked in deep green wool, her hair hidden under a hood lined with fox fur. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had no need to rush. Beatrice welcomed her with a slight bow, and Maria poured her a cup of something steaming, the scent of anise rising from it. On the table was a single place setting, a plate of glazed earthenware, a silver spoon polished to a mirror. No other chairs were drawn up. This was not a meal for sharing. It was a meal for one, and everything in the room bent toward that purpose. Ines watched as the woman removed her gloves, revealing hands pale and elegant, the nails shaped in a way no laboring woman could keep. She sat, and the first dish was placed before her, a small pastry, its crust glistening with egg wash, steam curling from the seam where it had been cut. The woman ate slowly, her eyes never lifting from the plate, as though each bite demanded her full attention. Ines could smell the filling: figs, cinnamon, and something deeper, almost smoky, perhaps from the fire's edge. When the second dish came, roasted quail with a glaze that shimmered under the candlelight, Ines saw the faintest smile touch the woman's lips. It was not joy exactly, but recognition, as if she had been waiting for this taste for a long time. No conversation passed between them, yet there was a current in the air, something warm and invisible that flowed from the cooks to the guest. Ines felt it as a tingling at the base of her skull, a quiet hum in her chest. The woman finished, dabbed her mouth with a linen napkin, and placed a single silver coin on the edge of the plate, not for the food, Ines thought, but for the secret. Then she left as she had come, silent, her green cloak vanishing into the frost. Ines stood in the doorway long after the latch clicked shut. She realized that the kitchen was not simply a place to feed bodies. It was a place to feed longing, to satisfy hungers that no sermon could name. And that night, lying in her narrow bed, she wondered what kind of dish would be made for her, if anyone ever dared. It was Sister Maria who first spoke to her about meaning. They were in the kitchen at dusk, the light from the narrow windows already fading, when Maria handed her a bowl of candied orange peel. "Bitter first, then sweet," she said, as if that explained everything. She told Ines that certain dishes were chosen not only for their taste, but for what they said without words. Figs, for example, were for longing, soft and ripe, split open like a mouth waiting to be kissed. Almonds were for patience, for the slow waiting before something precious could be claimed. Ines listened, her fingers sticky from the sugar syrup, and began to see the truth. Recipes were letters, each ingredient an alphabet. Honey could mean devotion or possession, depending on how it was used. Cinnamon was comfort, but mixed with pepper, it became a challenge, a dare to take more than one should. Maria never said who these messages were meant for, but the way she measured spices was like the way a poet chooses words. That night, they prepared a tart of quince and rosemary, the fruit's fragrance filling the kitchen like a low, warm chord. As Ines brushed the glaze over its surface, She wondered if she was writing her first sentence in this secret language. When the tart was taken away by a man whose face she barely saw, she felt a strange pang, as if a letter she had written were being sent far away without her knowing the address. From then on, Ines began to read the dishes like prayers on a page. She could tell when the food was meant to soothe, when it was meant to tempt, and when it was meant to wound. And sometimes she caught herself wondering which flavors would be chosen if the message were meant for her. The moon that night was swollen and golden, hanging low enough over the cloister garden that it seemed to rest on the chimney tops. Inside the kitchen, the air was thick with the scent of saffron, not the faint, ghostly note she sometimes caught in rice at feast days, but an almost overwhelming perfume, warm and metallic, like gold turned to steam. The saffron threads floated in a shallow pan of milk, each one releasing its color in slow, spiraling bursts. Beatrice worked silently, her hands steady as she folded the golden milk into a custard the color of sunrise. Maria sliced poached pears into thin fans, arranging them atop the custard with a precision that made each plate look like an altar. Ines's task was simple: to sprinkle crushed pistachios over the top, each fragment of green a small defiance against the yellow glow. She could feel the heat of the oven on her cheek, hear the soft hiss of the custard settling. The guest that night was a young man, his hair damp as if he had come through mist or rain. He said nothing, but when the saffron custard was set before him, he closed his eyes after the first bite and didn't open them again until the plate was clean. Something in his stillness unsettled Ines, as if the taste had carried him far away, to a place beyond the reach of the convent walls. After he left, Ines lingered by the hearth. The saffron scent clung to her skin, its color to her thoughts. She realized that some flavors were not meant to comfort or seduce, but to haunt, to follow a person long after the last bite. And as she washed the dishes in the warm water, she thought, perhaps the moon itself would taste like this, if only she could hold it in her mouth. It began with a simple mistake, or so Ines thought. The night had been rushed, the air in the kitchen tight with urgency. Beatrice was preparing a roast capon stuffed with chestnuts and apricots, brushing the skin with a syrup so glossy it seemed to catch the firelight like lacquer. Maria was kneading bread with one hand and stirring a pot of spiced wine with the other, her brow damp from the heat. A knock came at the door, 2 short raps, a pause, then one long. It was not one of their regular guests, but a pale young man in the livery of the local bishop. He claimed to have been sent to collect a donation for the poorhouse, his voice polite but hurried. Beatrice glanced at Maria, and something unspoken passed between them. Then, instead of the usual loaf or wedge of cheese offered for charity, she wrapped the capon meant for someone else entirely, and placed it in the man's arms. When he left, the kitchen seemed to hold its breath. Maria's hands froze on the bread, her eyes sharp as a blade. "That bird will be eaten at the bishop's table by tomorrow noon," she said quietly. "And when it is, someone will ask where it came from." There was no anger in her voice, only the flat weight of inevitability. That night, Ines lay awake imagining the dish on a table surrounded by priests and advisors, the rich scent of chestnuts and apricots filling a hall lined with crucifixes. She imagined their surprise, perhaps even their suspicion, at a flavor so unlike anything from the convent kitchens they knew. And she understood that the danger of their work was not only in who it was for, but in who might see. The danger became real 2 days later. The sun was bright on the cloister tiles when a shadow fell across the kitchen doorway, not the slim silhouette of a guest slipping in by night, but the broad shape of a man in heavy robes. It was Father Lazaro, the bishop's confessor, his eyes like wet stones, his mouth fixed in a smile that did not touch them. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his gaze moving over the shelves, the hearth, the cooling loaves on the table. "I hear," he began, "that the Lord has blessed your convent with a talent for hospitality." His tone was smooth, but the weight of each word made Inés's stomach tighten. Beatrice wiped her hands on her apron and offered him bread, the plainest they had, but his eyes lingered on the spice jars lined neatly by the window. Maria kept to the hearth, stirring a pot of soup that smelled of nothing more exotic than onions and barley. Inés could feel the tension in the air, a kind of stillness that pressed against her ears. Father Lazaro spoke of charity, of service, of obedience, words that seemed harmless but felt like fingers probing for a crack in the wall. Before leaving, he paused at the door and looked back at the three women. "I shall return," he said, as though it were a promise, not a courtesy. When he was gone, the kitchen exhaled. Beatrice leaned against the table, her hands gripping its edge. "He knows something," she murmured. Maria only nodded, her eyes fixed on the fire as if she could read in its flames the shape of what was to come. And in that moment, Inés realized that the kitchen she loved, with its warmth, its scents, its secret messages, was also a doorway to ruin if the wrong person chose to walk through. The next nights were stripped of perfume. The kitchen, once heavy with the scent of saffron and cinnamon, now smelled only of bread crust and boiled cabbage. Beatrice called it the disguise, a week of food so ordinary that even the most curious nose would grow bored. Figs were hidden away in earthen jars, honey sealed under wax, saffron threads buried beneath sacks of barley. Maria cooked in silence, her movements sharp and economical, as if every gesture needed to shed its softness. Even the fire seemed smaller, its flames low and functional, without the dancing shadows that once made the walls feel alive. The bowls served at the sisters' table were pale, colorless, and utterly forgettable. Inés hated it. She missed the golden glow of custards, the way the air used to feel warm against her skin, the unspoken music of flavors layering in the night. But plainness had its own discipline. She learned how to make broth so thin it barely stained the ladle, how to bake bread without gloss, how to slice root vegetables into shapes that hid their beauty. "If they cannot taste our work," Beatrice said, "they cannot accuse us of it." The words were simple, but their weight made Inés feel as if she were practicing not cooking, but erasing. At night, she still dreamed of color and scent. In those dreams, the kitchen returned to her as it once was, but when she awoke, all she smelled was the faint, unremarkable bitterness of cabbage water cooling in the dark. It was on the fourth day of this forced plainness that Father Lazaro returned. This time, he did not linger in the doorway. He stepped directly into the kitchen, his hands clasped, his eyes moving slowly over every surface. "May I see your stores?" he asked, in a voice that pretended to be casual. Beatrice gave a short nod, and Ines was sent to fetch the key to the pantry. Inside, the shelves looked as bare as possible: barley, lentils, onions braided in dusty ropes. But on the far side, tucked between two sacks of flour, was the jar. It was unmarked, its lid sealed with wax, but Ines knew what lay inside: candied orange peel, soaked in spiced syrup. The scent, though faint, still curled through the air if one leaned too close. Father Lazaro's eyes drifted toward it. Ines felt the air tighten around her as he stepped forward. She moved quickly, placing herself between him and the jar, her hand resting casually on the sack of flour as though she were steadying herself. "We save these for feast days," she said, her voice quiet but steady, "for the sick sisters who cannot join the table." He looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then he smiled, the kind of smile that might mean nothing or everything, and turned away. Ines's pulse thudded in her ears as she followed him out, the weight of the jar still in her mind. She realized that keeping the kitchen secrets was not only about knowing when to look away, but also about knowing when to lie. Father Lazaro came again, but this time not as a shadow at the door. He arrived in the pale light of morning, his robes trailing frost from the cloister stones, and with him came two novices carrying baskets of fresh game, partridge and rabbit, still stiff from the night's cold. "A gift," he said, his voice smooth, "for the sisters' table, and perhaps something finer for the bishop's own supper." The words were not a suggestion. Beatrice accepted the baskets with a neutral nod, but Ines saw the flicker in her eyes, the quick, calculating measure of what was being asked. Lazaro lingered, his gaze moving from the hearth to the spice shelf, pausing just long enough to make the air heavy. "The bishop is fond of saffron," he added, "and of your skill, Sister Maria." Then he turned and left, the door closing with a quiet finality. Ines knew immediately what it meant. He wanted a dish that would carry the taste of the kitchen of sin straight to the bishop's table, where it could be savored, questioned, and perhaps traced back to them. To refuse was to draw suspicion. To comply was to give away the very thing they had tried to protect. That night, the kitchen felt different, like a battlefield where no one spoke the name of the enemy. Maria worked in silence, the partridge laid out on the block, the saffron threads glinting like gold coins under the lamplight. Ines's stomach knotted as she fetched the mortar, knowing that every stroke of the pestle brought them closer to the moment when their secret might slip beyond these walls forever. It was Beatrice who proposed the solution, not refusal, not surrender, but something between. "We will give him saffron," she said, "but we will give it in a way only we understand." Her plan was quiet but sharp, a partridge roasted with saffron and orange, but under the golden glaze would be a seasoning no one outside the kitchen could name, a subtle bitterness from crushed myrtle leaves, a note that would unsettle the tongue without revealing itself. All night they worked with an intensity that felt almost like prayer. The saffron milk was poured over the bird in slow streams, the orange peel curled and laid with deliberate care. Ines was given the task of preparing the myrtle, grinding it fine and mixing it with a whisper of clove. She could smell its wild, resinous edge even through the saffron's warmth, a hidden shadow beneath the gold. When the dish was finished, it gleamed like a crown in the candlelight, the air rich and intoxicating. Ines could not tell if the beauty of it was a gift or a weapon. The covered dish was carried away by one of Lazaro's novices, his expression unreadable. Long after he had gone, the three women stood in the kitchen, the fire burning low. No one spoke of what they had done, but the air between them held the weight of an unspoken vow. If the bishop tasted the hidden thorn, he would know he was not welcome to ask for more. The reply arrived like a ghost, quiet, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. It came 2 days after the saffron partridge had left the kitchen, in the grey lull of late afternoon, when the air in the cloister felt heavy with rain that would not fall. Ines had been slicing onions for a thin broth when she heard the faint scratch of paper against stone. She looked up to see nothing but the still air of the hallway. But at her feet lay a folded scrap of parchment, the kind used for personal letters, not official notices. She picked it up carefully, the paper warm as if it had been carried close to the body. The handwriting was small and exact, the strokes deliberate, the ink fresh enough to smudge if touched. There was only a single line written there. It lingers. No name, no seal, but the three of them knew, without a word spoken, that it had traveled from the bishop's table to their hearth. Maria read it once aloud, her voice slow, as if tasting each syllable the way one tastes a strong spice. Then, without hesitation, she held the paper over the open flame. The ink blackened first, curling into smoke, before the parchment crumbled entirely. The kitchen was silent except for the soft pop of the firewood, and in that silence the meaning settled like ash in Ines's chest. She didn't need to ask what it meant. She had tasted the partridge herself, a stolen bite when Maria's back was turned. The saffron had been gold on her tongue, the orange peel bright like sunlit glass, but the myrtle had been different. It had clung to her mouth like a shadow clings to the edge of a candle's light, not unpleasant but impossible to ignore. Hours after, she could still feel it there, a faint resinous ghost at the back of her throat. That was the thorn Beatrice had hidden, the message folded inside the flavor. The note was not a reprimand. It was not outrage or warning. It was recognition. It meant that the message had been read, and more dangerously, that it had been understood. And understanding invited reply. That night, Beatrice locked the spice cabinet even while they worked. Maria kept her recipes close to her chest, measuring spices in her palm instead of from the jar, as if the air itself might be listening. Ines felt the weight of the unspoken truth. They were no longer just cooking for mouths. They were in a conversation, one conducted in heat and scent and taste, and the other party had just told them he would not forget. Evening had settled over the convent, the last bell's echo still shivering in the cloister when Father Lazaro stepped into the kitchen. His presence filled the doorway like a shadow, but his hands carried something that caught the firelight in a deep liquid red, a bottle of wine, the seal thick with wax, the glass cool and heavy. A gift from His Grace, he said, setting it on the table with a care that was almost ceremonial. He wondered what you might make of it. The bottle was not ordinary. Ines saw that at once. The glass was dark green, almost black, the neck slender, the base thick and wide like those used for wines aged longer than some lives. The seal bore no crest, only a pressed circle of plain wax, anonymous but deliberate. The wine sloshed inside like a captive knight, catching the light in slow ruby flashes. Beatrice did not speak at first. She ran her fingertips over the wax as if reading it for meaning, then glanced at Maria. The elder nun's jaw tightened, her hands stilling on the chopping board. They all knew the truth that Lazaro's mild tone hid. This was not merely a gift. It was a question, a request for an answer. The bishop had tasted their language and wanted another sentence. When the door closed behind him, the kitchen seemed to breathe in. The cork was pulled, and the first scent was deep, figs, leather, a faint wisp of smoke. Maria poured it into a copper pan and set it over the smallest flame, letting the liquid thicken until it coated the back of a spoon like velvet. Into the wine, she stirred crushed figs, their red flesh dissolving into the darker red, the seeds glinting like grains of gold. She added a pinch of something sharp, not vinegar, not spice, and would not tell Ines what it was. The air grew heavy with the scent, sweet and faintly dangerous. Ines toasted almonds at the hearth's edge, the shells cracking softly, the warm aroma folding into the wine's perfume. Beatrice worked beside her, turning the hair on the spit, its skin crisping to a deep lacquered brown. The hair was basted in the fig wine until it gleamed under the firelight, each drop sliding down the skin like molten garnet. As they plated it, Beatrice spoke in a low voice. If we answer him, we step closer. Ines understood. Closer meant being seen. Closer meant less room to hide. And yet, none of them suggested sending anything less than perfect. Because in this strange, dangerous dialogue, a poorly made dish was not silence, it was insult. And insult could be fatal. The hair was wrapped, the almonds tucked in a small pouch beside it, and when it left the kitchen in the arms of one of Lazaro's novices, the room felt oddly still. Not relieved, not at peace, but waiting, the way one waits after knocking on a locked door, knowing someone is inside and listening. It was a clear morning when he came, and that made it worse. A storm would have given them cover, rain to blur footsteps, clouds to swallow voices, but the sky was wide and sharp, the sunlight spilling across the cloister like gold poured from a jug. Ines was kneading dough in the kitchen when the first sound reached her, the low creak of the outer gate, followed by the measured rhythm of boots on stone. She looked up in time to see Father Lazaro step into the doorway, his black robes framing a figure behind him. The bishop. His grace was taller than she expected, his shoulders broad under a winter cloak the color of deep wine. The fabric caught the light with a muted sheen, and the faint scent of sandalwood and myrrh preceded him into the room. He did not speak at first, only let his eyes move over the kitchen, the hearth, the shelves, the copper pots, as though reading an old book he had only just remembered he owned. Beatrice stood by the table, hands resting lightly on the edge, her face as composed as a painting. Maria by the fire inclined her head just enough to be polite. Ines, unsure if she should bow or flee, kept her eyes on the dough, but her ears strained for every sound. The bishop's voice, when it came, was smooth and unhurried. "I have tasted your work," he said, each word measured like a bead on a rosary, "but I have never seen the place where it is born." His gaze landed briefly on Ines, and she felt it like a fingertip tracing the rim of a glass, not touching, but vibrating the air around her. He walked slowly around the kitchen, the sound of his boots softened by the worn flagstones. His gloved hand brushed the side of a copper pot, the leather whispering against the metal. "It smells of nothing today," he observed, the corners of his mouth lifting slightly. "Prudent." It was not a compliment. Without asking permission, he removed his gloves and set them on the table. "Today I will eat here." The words fell into the room like stones dropped into still water, ripples spreading outward. Ines's heart thudded once hard before returning to its place. They had spoken to him in saffron, in myrtle, in wine. Now he had come to hear them in person, and there would be no space for error. They worked with the door open. That was the first difference. Normally, the kitchen's secrets were contained by thick oak and iron, but now sunlight poured in, gilding the flour dust in the air, turning the steam from the pots into pale banners. The bishop sat at the small table near the hearth, the one they usually used for peeling vegetables. His cloak was folded neatly over the back of the chair, his hands resting loosely on the wood, his eyes following every motion. Beatrice set water to boil, the surface trembling with the first hint of heat. Maria chose ingredients as though pulling them from an invisible shelf, rosemary still damp from the garden, pears just soft enough to release their perfume when cut. She worked in silence, but there was music in her movements, the slow arc of the knife through the fruit, the pause to inhale before sprinkling salt. Ines was given the task of tending the fire. She crouched by the hearth, feeding it with small, deliberate pieces of oak until the flames burned high enough to reach the base of the pan. The fire's heat wrapped around her, but her skin prickled for another reason. The bishop's gaze touched her often, a quiet weight at the edge of her awareness. They decided on roasted hare, but with no hidden thorn this time. Instead, the language would be in the layering. Pears roasted alongside the meat, their sweetness seeping into the juices, rosemary releasing its sharp breath into the air. Ines brushed the hair with melted butter, the golden sheen catching the sunlight. She felt the bishop watching her hands, and though he said nothing, she knew he was reading her movements as one reads the lines of a letter. The dish was served on plain earthenware, the colors muted but alive, gold from the butter, green from the rosemary, the soft blush of pear against the browned meat. The bishop ate slowly, with the patience of a man who knows he is being answered. Between bites, he sipped water, his eyes never leaving the table. When the plate was clean, he set down his knife and fork with care. "You cook," he said finally, as one prays, with intention. His gaze shifted to each of them in turn, lingering last on Ines. But prayer, too, can be overheard. He rose, replaced his gloves, and left without another word. When the door closed, the kitchen seemed suddenly small, the sunlight colder. Ines exhaled only then, realizing she had been holding her breath for most of the meal. She did not know if they had been praised, warned, or invited to speak again, but she knew the game had changed, and from now on, the curtain between them and the bishop would remain open. After the bishop's visit, the kitchen seemed to fall into a strange quiet, not the restful silence of sleep, but the kind that lingers after a loud noise, when the air is still vibrating from its echo. No guests came. No notes were slipped under the door. No baskets arrived with game or exotic spices. The only deliveries were the usual sacks of flour, the ropes of onions, the crates of root vegetables with dirt still clinging to them. The first night after his visit, they cooked nothing special. Barley soup, dark bread baked in round loaves. The scent was humble, even dull, and the bowls cooled quickly once set on the table. Ines felt the absence of their true work like a missing limb. She caught herself opening the spice cabinet without thinking, her hand hovering over the jar of cinnamon before she closed it again. On the second night, the air turned colder. A frost settled on the cloister garden, and the herbs froze stiff in their beds. Ines rose before dawn to find the kitchen dark, the hearth cold. Beatrice was already there, sitting at the table with her hands folded, staring at nothing. When Ines asked if she should light the fire, Beatrice only shook her head. "We wait," she said. For what? She didn't explain. On the third night, a pot of plain lentils simmered on the stove, the steam rising in thin, reluctant threads. Maria stirred it with the same care she once gave to custards and sauces, but the rhythm was different, slower, heavier, without the small flick of the wrist that had always been her signature. The kitchen's heartbeat had changed, and though no one said it aloud, Ines knew they were holding their breath for something, an invitation, a signal, a shadow in the doorway. But it never came. And so, by the fourth night, she began to wonder if the conversation had ended, and if the bishop had taken the last word with him. It was almost a week later when the change came, sudden, as if someone had turned a key in a hidden lock. The day had been unremarkable, filled with the usual labor, scrubbing the cloister steps, mending the frayed edge of her robe, hauling buckets of water from the well. But when Ines stepped into the kitchen that evening, she stopped short. The air was warm again, and it smelled of almonds and rosewater. Beatrice was at the table, grinding blanched almonds into a fine paste, her sleeves rolled up. Maria was at the hearth, stirring a pot whose steam carried a sweetness that seemed to cling to the skin. On the counter, a tray of figs lay split open, their ruby centers glistening under a thin drizzle of honey. No one said how or why the flame had returned, but it was there, in the low hum of activity, in the light that flickered across the copper pans, in the rhythm of knives against the cutting board. The kitchen was alive again, and with it came the familiar current of secrecy. Ines was handed a small bowl of rosewater to pour into the almond paste. The scent rose up, cool and floral, filling her lungs until she felt light-headed. She mixed it slowly, the pale cream softening under her spoon until it gleamed. Beside her, Beatrice shaped the paste into small, perfect spheres, pressing a sliver of candied orange into the top of each. "These are not for the sisters," Maria said quietly, without looking up, "nor for the bishop." She didn't need to say more. Whoever they were for, it meant the kitchen was once again writing its language in flavors, and that the message was not one of surrender. As the night wore on, Ines felt the warmth of the hearth seep back into her bones. The fear had not gone. It was still there, like the ember under the ash. But the forbidden flame had returned, and with it, the certainty that the kitchen would not remain silent forever. The night after the forbidden flame returned, the kitchen was different in a way Ines could not fully name. It wasn't only the scents, though they were rich again, curling into the corridors like whispers that knew exactly where to linger. It was the way Beatriz and Maria moved. There was no rush, no need to meet a knock at the door or to match the hour of a waiting carriage. Instead, their hands worked with a patience that made each gesture feel deliberate, almost tender. The dish they made that night was not meant to leave the convent. No guest would eat it, no messenger would carry it away. It was a tart, its crust thin and flaky, holding a filling of almond cream and slices of poached pear. The pears had been simmered in wine until they blushed pink, then brushed with honey until they glistened as if kissed by light. Maria shaped the crust with her fingertips, pressing the dough into the pan in slow, even circles. Beatriz peeled the pears, the skin slipping away in curling ribbons that shone under the lamplight. The scent of cinnamon bloomed when she sliced them, filling the room with a warmth that made the air itself feel softer. When the tart emerged from the oven, the crust was golden and the filling set just enough to tremble. They placed it on the table without cutting it, letting it rest while steam rose in pale curls. Then, without a word, Beatrice fetched 4 plates, one for each of them, and one extra, which she set at the far end of the table untouched. Ines didn't ask why, but she felt the meaning in her chest. This tart was theirs alone, a flavor meant not as a letter to the outside world, but as a bond, a confession written in butter and pear, understood only by the hands that had made it. When she took her first bite, the crust shattered softly between her teeth, the almond cream melting into the sweetness of the pear. For a moment, she forgot the bishop, the danger, even the rules of the convent. All she knew was that the kitchen could keep secrets for itself, too. The tart was gone by morning, every plate scraped clean except the one left untouched at the end of the table. It sat there, a thin film of honey catching the light through the small window, until the bell for prime prayers called them away. By the time they returned, the plate was empty. No one asked who had taken it. No one claimed the last slice. That afternoon, the kitchen was quiet, the air heavy with the lingering perfume of pears and almonds. Ines swept the floor in slow strokes, her mind replaying the taste, not just the sweetness, but the way it had seemed to carry something unsaid. The pears had been soft, yes, but there was something about the almond cream, its faint bitterness beneath the sugar, that felt like a secret not meant to be told aloud. She realized then that food could carry more than one message at once. The same tart could be comfort to one mouth, longing to another, and confession to the one who made it. Perhaps that was why Beatrice's hands had moved more slowly the night before, or why Maria's eyes had been fixed on the fire as if she were seeing something far beyond it. When Ines passed the pantry later, she noticed the jar of rose water open, the cork resting loosely beside it. She lifted it to her nose and inhaled deeply, letting the floral coolness fill her lungs. The scent clung to her long after she stepped away, a reminder that some flavors could follow you through the day, tugging at you like a half-remembered dream. That night, as she lay in her narrow bed, she thought about how much had been said in that tart without a single word being spoken. She wondered if, one day, she would be able to cook like that, not to please, not to send a message, but to place a piece of herself into the hands of another, trusting they would taste what could not be told. The decision came without words, as such decisions often do. It was in the way Beatrice closed the pantry door and rested her hand on the latch a moment longer than necessary. In the way Maria pressed her lips together when she looked at the empty spice jars, not in disappointment, but in acceptance. The kitchen had spoken to the outside world long enough. Now it would speak one last time. The dish was to be something unmistakable. Not subtle, not hidden, but a farewell made of flavor. Beatrice chose duck, the meat rich and dark, with a skin that would turn crisp under a slow, steady fire. Maria fetched pomegranates from the cool storage, their skins dull and leathery on the outside, hiding a heart of shining seeds within. Ines was sent to the garden, where she clipped the last sprigs of thyme still alive in the frost-bitten beds, the leaves releasing their sharp green scent into the cold morning air. The kitchen worked as it had in the early days of The Secret. The duck was salted and left to rest, the fat rendering slowly as the fire caught its rhythm. Pomegranates were cut open, their red seeds falling into a bowl like beads spilling from a broken rosary. Their juice stained Ines's fingers, the color soaking deep into her skin, and no amount of washing could take it away. Maria simmered the seeds with honey and wine until they broke down into a sauce the color of garnets, thick enough to cling to the spoon. When she tasted it, her eyes closed, not in approval, but in something quieter, a moment of memory perhaps. Beatrice basted the duck in that same sauce, each layer sealing the flavor deeper into the meat. The scent filled the room until the air itself felt heavy with sweetness and iron, like the perfume of a garden after rain and blood. When it was done, the duck was placed in a wooden chest lined with cloth, along with a small sealed jar of the remaining sauce. The chest was given to one of the few guests they still trusted, a woman who wore no ring but carried herself like someone used to being obeyed. No explanation was given, no instructions, only the weight of the dish in her arms and the scent that would follow her long after she left the gates. Ines watched the woman walk away through the cloister, her figure shrinking into the pale winter light, and wondered if the message would be understood. She suspected it would. After all, it was not meant to open a conversation, but to close it. 2 nights after the duck left the convent, the kitchen came alive in a way Ines had never seen. This time, the door was bolted from the inside. No guest would come. No messenger would carry anything away. This was a feast made for them alone. The sisters who had kept the secret, tended the fire, and measured the spices with care enough to speak without being overheard. The menu was whispered between Beatrice and Maria as they worked. Fresh bread brushed with olive oil and baked until the crust cracked under the touch. Soft cheese warmed until it yielded to the knife. Figs split open and stuffed with almonds. And a pot of custard thickened with saffron that had been hidden away for months, saved for a night like this. The kitchen filled with the low hum of activity, punctuated by the sounds of knives against boards and spoons against bowls. Inez tended the bread, turning each loaf so that the crust blistered evenly, releasing the deep, nutty scent of flour and oil into the air. Beatrice assembled the figs with slow precision, pressing each almond into place as if setting a jewel. Maria worked at the hearth, stirring the custard with the same gentle rhythm she once used for dishes meant for strangers, her wrist moving in a circle that seemed to draw the whole room into its motion. When the food was ready, they set the table not in the refectory, but right there in the kitchen. The fire was banked high, its light playing on the copper pots and the glazed surface of the bread. Plates were placed without ceremony, and yet there was a reverence in the way each woman took her seat. The first bite of the bread was like a return, the crust shattering, the inside warm and soft, the oil bringing a fullness that stayed on the tongue. The figs were sweet and nutty, their honeyed juice spilling onto fingers and lips, and no one minded the mess. The saffron custard was the last dish served, its golden surface trembling slightly in the spoon. It tasted of warmth and quiet luxury, the kind that needs no audience. They ate slowly, speaking little, not because there was nothing to say, but because every flavor seemed to carry its own words. Inez felt the warmth spread through her, not from the fire, but from the certainty that this was theirs alone. For the first time, the kitchen was not a place of messages sent and received, but a sanctuary, a room where the world outside could not intrude. When the plates were empty and the fire burned low, no one moved to clean. They simply sat there, breathing in the last traces of saffron and smoke, letting the night settle around them like a final blessing. In the days that followed the feast, the kitchen returned to its rhythms, but they were gentler now, stripped of the restless undercurrent that had marked the months before. The door was left ajar in the evenings, not as an invitation, but as a sign that there was nothing hidden for anyone to come looking for. No messengers crossed the threshold, no notes curled under the door, no footsteps echoed in the corridor at forbidden hours. The spices remained in their jars, lined like quiet sentinels on the shelf. Sometimes Inez would run her fingertips over them, the rough weave of the cinnamon sticks, the papery fragility of dried bay leaves, the faint oily sheen of nutmeg, but she did not open them. Their scent stayed locked in, the air of the kitchen carrying only the honest smells of bread, onions, and broth. It was not a deprivation, but a choice, and that made it feel different. In the afternoons, sunlight slipped through the high window above the pantry, laying a pale gold square on the flagstones. It became a ritual for Inez to pause there, broom in hand, and stand in the light for a moment, the dust rising in slow spirals. She would think about all that had happened in this room, the hidden messages, the dangerous games, the dishes that carried feelings stronger than any sermon. And she would realize that the silence now was not emptiness. It was fullness, resting. One evening, as she kneaded dough, Maria came to stand beside her, her hands warm on Inez's wrists as she guided the folding of the bread. There was no lesson spoken, only the pressure of palms, the quiet weight of experience passed from one pair of hands to another. When Beatrice joined them at the table, she brought a small plate of candied orange peel, not for trade, not for sending away, but simply to be shared. The three of them ate it in silence, the sugar crunching softly, the citrus bright on the tongue, each piece disappearing as slowly as possible. When night fell, The kitchen was left clean and dark, the fire's embers glowing faintly in the grate. Ines lingered at the doorway, one hand resting on the wood, breathing in the faint mingling of bread and smoke. She thought about how much could be said without speaking, and how much could be kept without hiding. Then she stepped away, letting the door swing almost shut, the narrow line of light fading into the hallway. The silence followed her, not a shadow, not a weight, but a companion. And in that silence she knew the kitchen had never belonged to the bishop, or to the guests, or to the world outside. It belonged to them, and that was enough.